7 weapons, 6 decades, one long continuous thread running through nearly every major war the United States fought across the entire 20th century, from the trenches of France to the jungles of Vietnam. Some of these weapons saved lives through genuine mechanical brilliance. One of them, in its earliest form, very nearly cost soldiers theirs through nothing more than a rushed, cost-cutting decision made far from any actual battlefield. This is the story of 7 guns nearly every American soldier of the 20th century came to know intimately, the decisions behind each one, and the specific moments that turned ordinary military hardware into genuine institutional memory passed down from one generation of soldiers to the next, a shared vocabulary of specific weapons that meant something instantly recognizable to anyone who had actually carried one into combat. Every week, we take apart the story stamped on the receiver of an American firearm, the soldiers who carried them, and the decisions that built a legend or lost one. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. The Springfield M1903 opened this entire story, a bolt-action rifle this channel has already covered in detail, born out of a humiliating lesson. American forces learned fighting Spanish-American war troops armed with superior German Mauser rifles during the Spanish-American War, a defeat serious enough to prompt an immediate official Army investigation into exactly how such a gap in weapons technology had been allowed to persist. The resulting design proved so closely modeled on that same Mauser system that Germany's own arms manufacturer successfully sued the United States government for patent infringement and won, a case that dragged through American courts for years while the rifle itself remained in full production and active military service, regardless of the unresolved legal dispute hanging over its own basic design, a legal debt America kept quietly paying right up until Germany itself became the enemy in the First World War, at which point the remaining claims were simply seized as enemy property. The Springfield M1903 armed American infantry through that same war and remained the officially preferred standard rifle for years afterward, an institution unto itself born directly out of a battlefield defeat nobody in Washington had wanted to see repeated on any future battlefield. The Colt M1911 joined American soldiers at almost exactly the same moment. This pistol, which this channel has also already covered in its own right, was developed after another documented battlefield failure entirely. American revolvers proved unable to reliably stop determined Moro fighters during an earlier colonial conflict in the Philippines. There, soldiers armed with the standard issue .38 caliber revolver found themselves shooting attackers multiple times without stopping them. Rigorous ballistic testing conducted by Army officer John Thompson, a name that will matter again shortly in this same list under an entirely different weapon, established the .45 caliber cartridge as the clear answer to that specific battlefield problem. And Browning's resulting pistol design proved so mechanically sound that it remained standard issue for more than 7 decades, carried by soldiers through 2 world wars, Korea and Vietnam, largely unchanged from its own original 1911 form despite decades of newer competing designs entering the broader firearms market. The M1911's own official retirement in 1985, replaced by the Beretta M9, largely for NATO ammunition, standardization reasons, rather than any documented failure of Browning's own design, did not actually end its military service the way a simple replacement date might suggest to a casual observer. Elite units including Delta Force and Marine Corps Force Reconnaissance continued carrying M1911 pattern pistols for years, and in some cases decades, after the M9 had become standard issue everywhere else in the American military, a quiet vote of continued confidence from operators whose own mission requirements gave them considerably more latitude to choose their own equipment than a conventional infantry unit typically enjoyed. Before we get into the weapon that connects both a legendary crime wave and a legitimate combat record, if you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. It costs nothing and it helps the channel keep telling these stories. The Thompson submachine gun, a weapon this channel has covered from the specific angle of exactly how badly its own timing diverged from its original purpose, arrived at the New York docks the same day the First World War ended, missing entirely the trench combat it had been specifically designed to solve After 2 years of dedicated development work, commercially adrift for more than a decade afterward, with the Army showing little post-war interest and police departments lacking the budget to purchase it in any real volume, the Thompson found an entirely different, considerably less intended customer base among Prohibition-era organized crime figures, a criminal notoriety that produced the first serious federal firearms regulation in American history before the weapon finally proved itself in the role John Thompson had always envisioned once the Second World War actually arrived, manufactured by the Million at Savage Arms, a company this channel has also documented in its own right, and carried by American paratroopers and infantry squad leaders across every major theater of that war. The Browning automatic rifle joined American squads carrying a similarly complicated origin story, a weapon this channel has covered as a design built for one specific tactical concept: soldiers walking forward across open ground, firing from the hip in a style of assault warfare that never quite matched the reality of how the weapon actually got used once real combat tested the original theory. It arrived too late for the war it was designed around and was quietly reshaped by the soldiers who actually carried it into something closer to a portable machine gun instead, an adaptation worked out by ordinary infantrymen under fire rather than handed down from any official design review. That reshaped, field-adapted version proved reliable enough to remain standard issue through the Second World War, the brutal winter fighting at the Chosin Reservoir in Korea, and the opening years of Vietnam, earning Private Charles de Glopper a posthumous Medal of Honor for exactly the covering fire role the weapon had, by that point in its own evolution, been specifically built to provide to a desperate platoon pinned down under fire. The M1 Garand, a rifle and a designer this channel has already covered extensively, replaced the Springfield M1903 as America's standard infantry rifle, heading into the Second World War, becoming the first semi-automatic rifle any major army fielded in large numbers, in giving American infantry a genuine firepower advantage over enemies still largely carrying bolt-action designs that required a manual working of the bolt between every single shot fired. General George Patton himself reportedly called it the greatest battle implement ever devised, a rare instance of unqualified praise from a commander not generally known for offering it freely to any single piece of equipment, regardless of its actual battlefield performance. And the rifle's own distinctive metallic ping, the sound of its empty en-bloc clip ejecting automatically after the last round fired, became so recognizable that some accounts suggest German soldiers learned to listen for it as a signal an American rifleman had just gone empty. The M1 Carbine rounded out the Second World War roster with an entirely different kind of story, a weapon this channel has covered as an unfinished project left behind by a dead designer, completed by a convicted killer who had taught himself gunsmithing in a prison workshop with no formal engineering training behind him at all, and then manufactured at a scale so large that a typewriter company, a jukebox maker, and the future manufacturer of the personal computer all found themselves building rifles for an army that needed 6 million of them faster than any single company, however experienced in the firearms trade, could possibly have delivered alone. Designed originally for rear echelon troops rather than frontline combat, the little carbine ended up carried by paratroopers, tank crews, and ordinary infantrymen across every theater of the war, who simply appreciated its light weight during long marches, regardless of what the original specification sheet had actually called for. The seventh weapon on this list very nearly earned its own place through failure rather than distinction, a genuinely different kind of story than any of the 6 weapons that preceded it on this same list. The M16, developed by engineer Eugene Stoner and adopted by the Army and Marine Corps, beginning in 1965, as American involvement in Vietnam escalated rapidly, replaced the M14 rifle with a considerably lighter, more modern design built around aluminum, plastic, and a smaller, faster cartridge that broke sharply with decades of wood and steel American rifle tradition stretching back through every weapon already covered on this same list. Some soldiers, unfamiliar with the rifle's own futuristic materials and unconventional appearance, reportedly nicknamed it the Mattel toy, a dismissive comparison to a children's plastic manufacturer that captured just how radically different the weapon looked next to the wood-stocked rifles it was actually replacing in American hands. That modern design very nearly failed catastrophically in actual combat once it actually reached soldiers fighting in Vietnam's own harsh jungle conditions. Cost-cutting decisions made far from any battlefield, including a rejected proposal to chrome plate the rifle's own chamber specifically to prevent corrosion in humid conditions, and a switch to a different gunpowder that fouled the weapon's own action considerably faster than originally tested formulations had, combined with a genuinely inexplicable failure to issue soldiers cleaning kits for a weapon that badly needed regular maintenance to function reliably at all, produced a wave of battlefield jamming failures soldiers experienced in the middle of actual firefights, spent casings frequently sticking in the chamber with no way to clear them except disassembling the rifle under fire or forcing a cleaning rod down the barrel by hand. Some troops, having watched their own rifles fail them at the worst possible moment, reportedly turned to captured enemy AK-47s rather than trust their own issued weapons, a genuinely damning indictment for any standard-issue American service rifle to have earned among the very soldiers it was supposed to be protecting. A congressional investigation led by the ECORD subcommittee in 1967 examined the crisis directly and concluded that the failure to correct known deficiencies in the rifle bordered on criminal negligence, a genuinely damning verdict from elected officials conducting a formal government inquiry rather than simply frustrated soldiers venting through informal channels back home. The Army responded with the improved M16A1, adding the chrome-plated chamber originally rejected on cost grounds, and finally issuing proper cleaning equipment alongside updated maintenance training, and malfunction rates dropped dramatically within about a year of those fixes, actually reaching soldiers in the field rather than remaining stuck in a bureaucratic pipeline. The M16 went on to become one of the most enduring rifle platforms in modern military history despite that genuinely disastrous early combat record. Its own descendants, still in active American service more than half a century after that first congressional investigation into exactly how badly its introduction had actually been mishandled by officials who had prioritized cost savings over the specific maintenance needs their own engineers had already identified. The specific cartridges these 7 weapons fired tell their own quieter story of institutional continuity running underneath the individual weapons themselves. The .45 ACP round, developed originally for the M1911, also powered the Thompson submachine gun decades later, a deliberate design choice that let logistics officers supply both weapons from a single shared ammunition stockpile rather than maintaining 2 entirely separate supply chains for 2 different weapons serving in the same theater of war. The .30-06 cartridge, developed originally for the Springfield M1903, went on to chamber the Garand as well, carrying a single caliber standard across 2 entirely different rifle designs, separated by more than 3 decades of continuous American service. That kind of quiet ammunition standardization rarely earns its own dedicated chapter in popular military history, but it shaped in practical terms exactly how easily American forces could actually supply and maintain multiple weapons simultaneously across a single, sprawling theater of war. A closer look at all 7 weapons together reveals a pattern that individual company histories rarely make quite so visible on their own. Nearly every weapon on this list traces its own origin back to a specific documented battlefield failure, rather than any peacetime engineering exercise conducted purely on theoretical grounds. The Spanish-American War exposing the Krag's own inadequacy against Mauser rifles, the Moro Rebellion exposing the .38 revolver's own inadequate stopping power, the trenches of the First World War exposing the absence of any weapon capable of clearing them quickly, and Vietnam's own jungle conditions exposing exactly what happens when a genuinely innovative rifle design reaches soldiers without the maintenance support its own engineers had specifically recommended. American small arms procurement across this entire 6-decade stretch reads less like a story of steady, confident technological progress and more like a repeated cycle of battlefield failure, prompting reactive redesign, a pattern that produced genuinely excellent weapons in the Garand and the Thompson's eventual wartime record, but that also produced the specific institutional negligence Congress itself formally condemned in the M16's own early Vietnam deployment. That generational continuity ran through actual families as much as through any institutional supply chain, veterans of one war returning home to raise sons who would eventually carry a different weapon on this same list into an entirely different conflict a generation later. A soldier's own father might have carried the Springfield 1903 through the trenches of France, while that same soldier carried the Garand across the beaches of Normandy or the M1 Carbine through the Pacific Islands. And that soldier's own son might, in turn, have carried the M16 through the jungles of Vietnam a full generation after that, each weapon on this list representing not just a specific piece of military hardware, but a specific live generational experience passed down within American families whose own service spanned multiple decades and multiple wars, fought under entirely different conditions against entirely different enemies. This is not a story about 7 weapons that simply worked well and earned their own reputations through flawless performance alone, since at least 2 of these 7, the Thompson and the M16, spent real portions of their own early histories associated with genuine failure, criminal notoriety, or documented battlefield malfunction rather than any immediate acclaim from the soldiers actually carrying them into combat. It is a story about how American soldiers across 6 decades of continuous conflict came to know a specific set of tools intimately, sometimes through genuine reliability earned the hard way across years of sustained combat testing, and sometimes through failures serious enough to draw a formal congressional investigation into exactly how badly a procurement decision had actually been mishandled, each weapon eventually becoming, through whatever combination of design merit and battlefield adaptation actually produced it, part of the same long institutional memory passed from one generation of American soldiers to the next, regardless of which specific war that soldier had actually fought in. Each of these 7 weapons also picked up its own distinctive nickname among the soldiers who actually carried it, informal terminology that spread through units far faster than any official military designation ever could, and that often revealed more about a weapon's own actual reputation than its formal name did. Soldiers called the Thompson simply the Tommy gun long before official Army correspondents ever used the phrase, a name that traveled from gangster films into military slang and back again across several decades. The Browning automatic rifle became simply the bar to nearly everyone who carried or served alongside one, a designation so universal that few soldiers who actually used the weapon ever bothered spelling out its full official name in casual conversation. The M16's own dismissive early nickname, the Mattel toy, captured genuine skepticism from soldiers raised on wood-stocked rifles and unconvinced that plastic and aluminum could possibly hold up under real combat conditions. Skepticism that turned out, at least initially, to be tragically well-founded given the weapon's own well-documented early jamming crisis in Vietnam. Museums, private collections, and the personal recollections of the shrinking number of veterans who actually carried these 7 weapons into combat now preserve a history considerably more complicated than any single weapon's own popular reputation usually suggests on its own. The Garand earned Patton's own genuine admiration. The M16 earned a formal congressional rebuke. The Thompson earned both a criminal reputation and a legitimate combat record within the same 20-year span, sometimes remembered by entirely different audiences for entirely different reasons depending on which specific decade of its own long history a given observer happened to encounter first. The civilian afterlife of these 7 weapons diverged just as sharply from one another as their own original military service records had, a final layer of divergence worth noting before closing out this particular list. The Garand and the M1 Carbine remain genuinely popular among American collectors and civilian shooters today, sold through official government surplus programs for decades after their own military retirement, and prized specifically for their documented combat history rather than in spite of it. The Thompson, by contrast, remains tightly restricted under the same National Firearms Act regulations its own criminal notoriety helped create back in 1934, meaning most surviving examples exist today either as expensive, heavily regulated transferable machine guns in the hands of serious collectors or as semi-automatic only variants built specifically to satisfy modern civilian firearms law. The M16's own direct civilian descendant, the semi-automatic AR-15 platform, has gone on to become one of the best-selling rifle platforms in the entire American civilian firearms market, a commercial afterlife considerably larger and more consequential than any of the other 6 weapons on this same list ever achieved once their own military service years had actually ended. Taken together, these 7 weapons trace not a simple linear story of steady American military progress, but a considerably more honest one, a series of specific, documented decisions, some brilliant, some badly mishandled, that nonetheless collectively armed American soldiers through nearly every major conflict of an entire century, from the muddy trenches of France to the humid jungles of Southeast Asia, each weapon carrying its own specific lesson about exactly what happens when careful engineering meets real battlefield conditions, and about what happens when it does not. If you want more stories about the weapons that became institutions in their own right, subscribe and we will keep finding them for you. See you in the next one.